Thank you for hosting, Bill. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thanks to all of you for making the time for this discussion. I should begin with a disclaimer. These are my views, and most of them are speculative in nature. We're all trying to make sense of the tea leaves that have been set out in front of us on this and many other questions by the new administration. I'm not representing Lawrence Livermore Laboratory or the Department of Energy. I'm representing myself. So, as you probably know, the White House has tasked the Department of Defense to conduct a nuclear posture review. This is one of 8, or depending on how you count them, 10 or 12 policy and posture reviews that the department will be conducting over the course of the next few months. This is the 4th nuclear posture review done since the end of the Cold War. The first was done by the Clinton administration in 1994 on its own initiative as a part of a general review of U.S. defense strategy after the Cold War. The next 2, by the George W. Bush administration and by the Obama administration, were done in direct follow-up to congressional taskings. And there is no tasking this time. Congress, the relevant committees, the Senate and House Armed Services committees, a year ago had a discussion about whether to impose upon an incoming administration in 2017 an obligation in this area, and chose not to. And the logic was the following, that one of the main nuclear policy questions confronting the nation is whether or not to modernize existing nuclear forces. And by and large, over the last 8 years, there was a sufficient degree of bipartisan agreement to begin the modernization process that obliging a new administration to conduct a kind of soup to nuts review of nuclear policy could pick apart the elements of that political agreement by reopening big questions. And thus reduce the odds of sustaining the agreement that exists in the Congress on this topic. So no obligation. So this leaves open a great many questions which the administration has not yet answered for itself. In 2008, the Congress told the incoming presidential administration that it would conduct a review that would be interagency in character. The 2009 review was the first interagency nuclear posture review. So not only was the Department of Energy at the table, so was the Department of State, the intelligence community, Homeland Security. 2008, the Congress told the incoming administration, we don't see how all of these pieces fit together anymore. How does your deterrence strategy fit your arms control strategy, fit your non-proliferation agenda, fit your countering nuclear terrorism problem? Where does counter-proliferation fit into all of this? And so we, the Congress, want a really comprehensive nuclear strategy that embeds questions that embeds DoD-focused questions in a larger national nuclear strategy. No such guidance this time. So an open question whether the scope will be broadly characterized in the way it was in 2009, or very narrowly circumscribed as it was in 1994. The nuclear posture review of 1994 was done by fewer than this many people. Half of them uniformed, half of them civilian, all DoD, and they were basically focused on a single question, which was what should we do with all of these nuclear forces left over from the Cold War? And you could imagine a very narrowly circumscribed nuclear posture review in the next few months that would look only at questions with DoD principal equities. Or you can imagine something broader. It's difficult to imagine that State Department and Department of Energy would simply agree to sit idly by while the Department of Defense is making some big decisions in these areas. But so this question of scope is open. The question of timing is open. Connoisseurs of this topic will know that the White House circulated a draft of the a day and a half before it circulated the actual guidance to conduct these reviews. This is a month ago now, 3 weeks ago. And the draft guidance charged the Department of Defense with conducting the nuclear posture review and ballistic missile defense review within 60 days, which we made it in 14 months. But if you're going to do something much narrower, maybe you could do it in a short period of time. So they've edited out the unworkable timeline and left open the question of, is this something that's going to be done in the spring, done in the summer so that it influences the next budget cycle, which basically is the autumn, or that's done next autumn and winter in the manner in which we did it. These are open questions about timeline, but they have a very practical consequence. If the review is going to be done quickly, it will be done by the people who are there now. If it's going to be done over a longer period of time, it's going to be started by the people who are there now and finished by some other people. And the people who are there now are the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who is, as you may know, a holdover, was asked to stay on for a while, Bob Work. The Chairman and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who have been in position for a couple of years, and their staffs, supported by the civilians in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And this would be very expeditious, but it also would involve nobody from the Trump campaign staff. So it's difficult to imagine that it would actually proceed in that fashion, producing an answer in the spring or summer. They will face a question, already face a question, about what level of engagement should the White House have in all of this. In 1994, the Department of Defense said to the White House, here, we're done. In 2009, we endlessly deliberated every element of policy in the formal interagency process and then with the senior cabinet leadership and the president. And so there's a question of what kind of role does the White House want to play? How does it play it? Well, it would play it through the staff of the National Security Council. Who are those people again? Some of them are there. The National Security Council staff has begun to come together on these questions. As you may know, the context here is that the Congress has obliged the new administration to shrink the staff of the National Security Council, which had grown to more than 300 people under the last two administrations. And so there is what would have been the normal process of realigning positions a little bit to reflect a new worldview is being accentuated by the need to not only realign but compress, shrink the number of directorates. So many of you in the room would be familiar with the WMD czar role on the National Security Council staff, the position Gary Seymour occupied, and then Laura Holgate. And then there was a separate directorate which John Wolfstall led on arms control and non-proliferation. So the first was nuclear security, broadly defined, meaning materials and international cooperation to strengthen material security and safety. The second, arms control and non-proliferation. There was a third office in the old structure looking at JCPOA implementation, and a fourth looking at nuclear counterterrorism. And these have all been put together in a single directorate. And the appointee there as senior director is a fellow named Chris Ford. Chris is a thoughtful, non-ideological, conservative man who was the George W. Bush administration's disarmament ambassador, and whom I first met, I think, in 2004 at a NATO event where he set out in an especially thoughtful way what life in today's world would be like if nuclear weapons had been retired from the scene. What in a practical way would that world look like? And this was thoughtful and interesting work. And so Chris is a person who's going to take very seriously the agenda that's been put in front of him. The other directorates that might play in a nuclear, but it's not clear that that directorate focused on non-proliferation, arms control, nuclear material safety and security actually fits in a DoD-focused nuclear posture review. So there would be other parts of the national security structure that would do that, and those are occupied at the moment by detailees, so people loaned to the White House by, in this case, the Armed Services and the National Nuclear Security Administration. But they're not really, they don't represent the political views of the administration, so they're in a weak position to exercise the kind of political leadership that's expected in a what's essentially a political review. There will be, well, the moment has already come where there's a certain taking stock of the experience of the prior administrations. We did this in 2009. Very early on, we said, what worked in the first two nuclear posture reviews and what didn't work and what lessons can we take from that? So for example, in 2001, the Bush administration produced a classified nuclear posture review report, which it circulated to Capitol Hill, and the same afternoon it was leaked. And it then became illegal for a government official to discuss the report, because to do so is to confirm its classified contents. So from the start, the Bush administration was hamstrung in implementing its agenda by virtue of having done a classified report. So one option for us would have been to do a classified report followed by an unclassified distillation of them. We said we don't need to do that. We can convey in an unclassified way the key policy priorities of the president, the assessments that have been made about the security environment, and the implementation actions. And the 2010 report sets out 100 or so actions to be taken by the government. We also looked at the record of implementation of the two prior reviews. The 2001 nuclear posture review, they wrote a very elaborate, top secret implementation document, which immediately got locked in a safe and forgotten. I mean, it's inaccessible to people when you write something at that level and tuck it away. And so all of the worker bees who are supposed to go out and do things, because the point of a policy review isn't to have a policy review, the point of a policy review is to implement new policy. And so to do that, people have to know. And you can't do that with a top secret document tucked in a drawer somewhere. So we had no top secret implementation document in 2009. Michelle Flournoy's guidance was that we would mainstream the results of all of the policy and posture reviews into the normal DoD and interagency processes, which worked pretty well. So this administration will now is going through its own thinking about what worked in prior reviews and what didn't. They also have a question about stakeholder engagement. One of the lessons we took from the George W. Bush administration experience was there were an awful lot of stakeholders in U.S. nuclear policy who in 2001 felt their stake had not been fully appreciated by the Bush administration. So I was mandated to open my door. Any U.S. ally, any foreign country that felt it had a stake in U.S. nuclear policy and posture was invited to come forward. I conducted about 75 or 80 consultations with different countries, mostly allies, but not all. There are, of course, stakeholders in the NGO community, many of them, not all of them in the United States. There are stakeholders, of course, on Capitol Hill. This was a large, exhausting, and somewhat, I think that the new administration might deem some of that experience somewhat constraining. We took advice, and if you're trying to do a top-down drive of change, it's not clear that you're really interested in hearing from all of the stakeholders. So lots of choices based on prior experience. A little bit about the substance? What are the inputs to a review like this? Well, there's an intelligence-based assessment of the security environment. What are the problems for which U.S. nuclear weapons are relevant? How have those problems changed over the period since the last nuclear posture review? What are the trends we can imagine? So this will drive a discussion of Iran. Is it in the business or out of the business? And how big is the uncertainty barrier there? This will drive a discussion of nuclear modernization by Russia and China. This will drive a discussion of what kind of nuclear posture might North Korea have in 8 to 10 years. This will drive a discussion of the perceptions of U.S. allies. Many of our allies feel as secure as they've ever felt. Many feel as insecure as they've ever felt. So one significant input will be an intelligence-based assessment of the security environment. Another significant assessment input is an assessment of the political environment. You know, if nuclear modernization is a 30-year problem, you can't have a solution that's going to be satisfying to one party and dissatisfying to the other party, because sooner or later that party is going to be in charge. The Obama administration worked to promote a sufficient degree of bipartisanship to sustain nuclear arms control and to sustain nuclear modernization. This required pulling back on some of the strongest ambitions of some in the administration. This new administration is going to have to go through the same calculus. It could cast bipartisan caution to the wind and say we're going to do some big, bold new things on nuclear policy, and find that it gets nowhere with them in the Congress, and these are dead in the water. A third input will be a review of the financial environment. You know, we have a president who's committed to, quote, greatly strengthen and expand our nuclear capability. And who did he just appoint as head of OMB? You know, the biggest budget hawk in the Republican Party. So there will be, and we can see many of these just fights coming inside the administration. A big fight between competing priorities. What's the most important thing? To reduce the deficit, which will be the OMB answer, or is it to make all sorts of new investments in infrastructure? And I mean, you know the list that have been discussed. So there will be some kind of coming to terms on the physical context. But of course, what interests us most, I think, will be the policy inputs to this review. And the one possible point of departure here, the easiest, would be for the new administration to pick up the 2010 report, which sets out 5 priorities, policy priorities, and ask, do we agree? Well, what would we change? And those, and I'm not sure I can still pass my own quiz on what those 5 priorities are, but they're to strengthen our efforts in the nuclear, non-proliferation, and counterterrorism worlds to reduce the most likely nuclear danger, which is that a terrorist taking a nuclear weapon from a proliferator sets one off in a U.S. city. That was priority number 1 for the Obama administration, and that followed the advice of the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission of 2008. This administration has already shown a lot of evidence that it doesn't think that's the top priority, not that it's not a priority. Our second priority was to reduce the number of nuclear weapons while preserving strategic stability with Russia. Third priority was to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. military strategy. The fourth was to adapt and strengthen regional deterrence architectures to enhance extended deterrence and the assurance of U.S. allies. And the fifth was to ensure a safe, secure, effective nuclear arsenal. So one logical beginning point for a policy discussion for this administration is, how does that fit with America First, peace through strength, greatly strengthen and expand our nuclear capability until the world comes to its senses. That was the rest of that phrase. What's that vision that he has in mind? So that's one way to think about this, where the policy discussion for this administration might start on nuclear policy. Another way to think about this is to go back to the advice of the Strategic Posture Commission and ask whether that advice remains valid. Now, and the Obama administration, to the frustration of some in the NGO community, took the advice of the Posture Commission in almost every possible respect, because it saw this as a long-term problem requiring bipartisan commitment, even if bipartisan consensus is kind of beyond our reach, but some sufficient degree of political agreement across the aisle to get business done. And the Strategic Posture Commission was created by the Congress in 2007 to deal with a particular problem. And the Congress's correct perception was that the middle in America's nuclear policy debate had disappeared, just as it's disappeared in so much of the rest of our national political life. And that you couldn't even say that in 2007, or much today, that there's a debate between two opposing. They don't debate each other. There's one camp that by and large, that has a certain set of assumptions and worldview about the future of nuclear weapons, which points to more new weapons, to a second nuclear age that's going to look a lot like the first. And it's about getting back to the business the way it used to be. And there's another camp that completely rejects that, rejects the role of nuclear weapons as legitimate and legal, and is pushing very hard for their elimination. And the Congress said, well, if we've really fallen out that far, how can we accomplish anything as a nation? If we lurch from this to this, back and forth over decades, we're not going to get much done. So what should we do about this? And they created this bipartisan commission and asked it two questions. Is there anything you can agree about? And if so, what is it? And the answer of the commission was, there is a strategy that offers the promise of sustained long-term bipartisan support. And this is a strategy that is balanced in character, balancing political, legal, and economic tools with military tools. And you use the political, legal, and economic tools to try to reduce and eliminate nuclear dangers. And you use military tools to protect yourself so long as those dangers remain, with deterrence. And so the Strategic Posture Commission said to the incoming Obama administration, pursue a balanced approach. You got to do both these military things and these political legal things, and that will enjoy sustained bipartisan support. And it more or less did. So is that the starting point for the Trump administration? How might they think their way through that calculus? Well, you can imagine the Trump administration looking at the political diplomatic side of that and saying, not so much. Meaning, we're at a crossroads with Russia on nuclear arms control. It's now clearly violating the INF Treaty. There's serious discussion in Moscow about pulling out of the New START Treaty. There's some discussion inside the Trump administration about, well, we know he's critical of the New START Treaty, and some discussion about where to go with that. The Russians have made it very clear that they're not interested in joining in deeper nuclear reductions on anything like the terms that the United States and NATO have offered, and that they're willing to do so only on terms that are so far out of the realm of the possible for the West that it appears that Russians leaders are not any more interested in nuclear arms control, a perception that's only reinforced by their violation of by the way, not just the INF Treaty, but the annual State Department report on compliance with arms control treaties to which the United States is a party indicates a litany of concerns about Russia's compliance with a string of arms control agreements. On the other hand, President Trump fancies himself an expert on nuclear arms control. He pressed on this in a little noticed interview during the campaign. He said, well, you know, I know a lot about this because of my uncle, who's a physicist at MIT. Well, he does have an uncle who's a professor at MIT. He's an electrical engineer, but still. And somebody said a couple of days ago, claiming authority on the subject, that in 1990, Trump wrote a letter to George H.W. Bush saying he wanted to be the START 1 negotiator because he really understood this problem and he was going to get the right deal for America. So, you know, make of these stories what you might, but here's somebody who may not be prepared to say arms control with Russia is dead, despite many in the arms control community thinking that that's so. What about nuclear non-proliferation? It would be implausible that President Trump would say, the Prague agenda was great and I'm going to keep working on that. I mean, President Clinton wouldn't have said that, because the Prague agenda raised expectations so far about what was possible that it was impossible to meet them. And moreover, the world proved unreceptive to a lot of the initiatives of the Obama administration to try to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime. A lot was accomplished, but a lot that seemed plausible in 2009 proved impractical. And of course, we're coming up on a significant review conference for the NPT in 2020, the 50th anniversary of the treaty, the 25th anniversary of the decision to extend it indefinitely. This comes at a time of rising political impact of the humanitarian consequences movement. And you can imagine this administration thinking, just walking away from all that. And on the other hand, I'm not sure what the other hand is. I mean, there haven't been many tea leaves on the other side of this equation, except you wouldn't have a Chris Ford in that role if you felt, I mean, he's not going to go quietly into the night in an administration that would say, nuclear non-proliferation, yeah, who needs to worry about that? So, there are others who've come into the system who I think don't buy into the worldview of we can just afford to walk away from the political and legal instruments for reducing nuclear dangers. Now, what about so if the recommendation of the Strategic Posture Commission was a, quote, balanced approach, political, legal, with military, what about the military side of the equation in this toolkit? Well, there are a lot of hard decisions. I've already hinted at the main one. Modernizing the nuclear triad is politically extremely contentious. It's very expensive. On the other hand, it is affordable. And the question is, do we choose to afford it? And is the president interested in maintaining the triad because not doing so would be inconsistent with greatly strengthening and expanding our nuclear capability? Or is he willing to do big, bold things of the kind Bill Perry has advised him to do, to move to a dyad or possibly even a monad? I think these are interesting and important questions to which we can't, and this goes back to what assessments made of the fiscal environment. Can you afford this bill? Is this what you want to afford, or are there other places you're going to put your money?
Can you refresh the dyad of Perry?
Well, Perry's had different visions of the dyad. Most recently, it's retire the ICBMs. And just the data point here is, you know, the triad is, the newest piece in it is the newest nuclear warhead, which went into service in 1990. That's the newest. There is no nuclear warhead that was designed to have a service life longer than 20 years. We're already, the next oldest thing is the submarine fleet, which is going to age out. They came into service 18 months apart. They're going to go out of service 18 months apart, beginning, and this is just has to do with how many times you submerge a metal tube. And you can only do it so many times. And these are all going to go out of service beginning in, I think it's 2027. Older than that are the ICBMs. The newest ICBM, 1971. And the rocket motors that are in them have a solid fuel that sits in them, which just ages away. And the newest bomber, well, we have 19 of the B-2s, but the B-52 is the newest in the nuclear mission, 1961. So there's not an option to just punt. In the absence of a decision to fund these things, they're going to go away. And the only way to save a significant amount of money is to not replace the ballistic missile submarines. They're the great lion's share of this bill. And what's the overall scale of effort we're talking about here to sustain nuclear operations? There are no nuclear operations, but to sustain the nuclear forces today consumes about 2% of the defense budget. To go through the entire planned modernization program that the Obama program of record over 20 years would be a total of about 6 to 7% of the defense budget. Now that's the whole defense budget, so it'd be more like 15% of the procurement budget, and there's no denying it's a lot of money, but it's a question of what seems affordable to us. A second main question that will be in front of the administration is what to do about extended nuclear deterrence. The president has set out a view during the campaign that maybe it would be just fine if our allies got nuclear weapons. After all, it's their responsibility to carry more of the burden. If we were to withdraw our role as an extender of nuclear guarantees to allies, a lot would change in our world. And I think they're beginning to have that discussion of what that might mean. I'm fairly confident that in golf games with Mr. Abe, this topic has been on the table. But what does it actually mean to think about burden sharing for extended nuclear deterrence? Well, the answer we, the Obama administration, had was, well, you look to your allies to do things. In Europe, you look to some nuclear sharing arrangements. But generally, you look to allies to do things in the non-nuclear realm that are good for deterrence, like ballistic missile defense, like some conventional strike capabilities of their own, like being resilient in cyberspace. And is that what this administration might do? I don't know. Next question. Are new nuclear weapons needed? The George W. Bush administration said yes, and the Congress said no. The Obama administration said we can extend the life of existing weapons, and that meets all military requirements, so we don't need new, and we don't need to have a political debate about having new nuclear weapons. Well, this question is back on the table. In part because, well, it should be back on the table, and not least because life extension is darn expensive. There's also a question about whether we have, in fact, the right capabilities for the kind of world we live in. And so that discussion will again unfold. With what result depends on the calculus that's made about how important is it to sustain bipartisan support for nuclear modernization. Because if the administration comes forward with a proposal for a new nuclear weapon, a Republican Congress might, I'm not saying would, but might support it, but the next Democratic Congress would rescind it. Another question is, should problems in the nuclear weapons complex be fixed? This is the one area where the Obama administration didn't really take the advice of the Strategic Posture Commission, which was to fix some problems in the nuclear weapons complex. So we have a production capacity of basically zero. We have to do the life extension work that's currently planned. There are materials we're going to run out of before we get the work done. And the technologies we're working with, because these are life extension programs, basically they're the technologies that were used to build the weapons in the first place, in some of the cases in the 60s and 70s. And in some cases materials that no longer exist, because they're no longer manufactured. And this is a hugely expensive undertaking to caretaker an infrastructure that's designed to do something we wouldn't design it to do today if we were starting over. And so my personal view is we could greatly reduce the cost of sustaining our deterrent if we could pursue modern manufacturing techniques, but that violates some people's sense of no new. Another important question that's on the table is about the Goldilocks approach. So our strategic policy has said that since the end of the Cold War, the primary problem for which our strategic posture is relevant isn't the problem of nuclear war with Russia or China. It's the problem presented by nuclear-armed regional challengers, what the Bush administration called rogue states and what the Obama administration called regional challengers. But North Korea and Iran, if it were to resume its nuclear pathway. And every president since the end of the Cold War has said, I reject mutual vulnerability with those states. I don't want to get into a relationship of mutual deterrence. I'm going to compose a missile defense that's big enough to negate their deterrent. I'm going to develop some conventional strike capabilities to go after their stuff, so they understand that if war comes, we'll have the initiative, not them, and we can fight it and win without employing nuclear weapons. And we're going to strengthen our extended deterrence relationship with our allies to make sure they remain secure and assured in the face of this. And all of this, the assessment has gone for 3 administrations. We can do without jeopardizing strategic stability with Russia and China, because we can negate the deterrence of North Korea and Iran with a limited missile defense and limited strike capabilities, and these can't possibly call into question the viability of the much larger forces of China and Russia. That's still the right way to think about this problem. Hard to say that our relationships with Russia and China are as benign as we thought they were when the last 3 nuclear posture reviews were conducted. Are they also as adversarial as some might think? Well, this is a matter of assessment and interpretation. And we can't exactly say that missile defense hasn't been destabilizing to strategic stability with Russia and China, because look at everything they've been doing in response. And more than that, they've been doing some things that aren't just in response to missile defense. I mean, supercavitating transoceanic nuclear-armed torpedoes as a response to missile defense. This is a different, an INF breakout. Are these just responses to restore the status quo ante in the U.S.-Russia strategic military relationship caused by, in legitimate response to the damage done by the U.S. effort to negate rogue states? Is it that simple? Well, that's not all that simple, but is it that simple? This is a big question which will have big implications for not just our nuclear strategy, but our missile defense strategy and conventional strike. So let me just wrap up. I mean, our markers on this are from the president are he's going to put America first, which probably has some implications for the discussion of strategic stability and extended deterrence. He's going to pursue peace through strength, which is going to have some implication for the what do you modernize question and how much do you spend, and what restraint do you show Russia and China. And greatly strengthen and expand our nuclear capability until the world comes to its senses. This is the hardest piece of this puzzle to speculate about. Let me just close with a couple of closing thoughts about implementation. So I said, we designed a process in 2009 having looked at the 2001 experience and observed the difficulty of the Bush administration in carrying forward a report into an implementation phase. How would this administration think about designing what it's launching now in order to ensure some implementation later that's effective and consistent? As I said, we did an unclassified report. We did a top secret presidential directive that followed the nuclear posture review that, no, sorry, that was 2001. We did then the deterrence requirements review, which some of you may recall as the 90-day study, but which produced a report to Congress in 2013. In other words, we had a series of top-down presidential guided activities that over time sustained focus inside the Obama administration on these questions and got a lot of work done. It doesn't get just done with a single report at the beginning of the administration. They will face this question about whether or not to mainstream the results in the way we did in the programming policy process or leave them somehow separate. And they will face these questions about promoting bipartisanship. And if you're committed to bipartisanship, that's not what you add at the end. You don't go out and say, I've just done all my homework, here's the answer, support it. That's bipartisan. No, you have to engage them all along the way in explaining what you're going to do, explaining what the questions are, giving them some idea of your preliminary thinking, getting feedback. You don't necessarily build buy-in from them, but at least you build informed discussion.